on your calendar so you know what's going on. You won't miss anything. If you're not on our mailing list, please sign up tonight so that you will be able to keep up with us, okay? So I'm going to introduce Andrew Olson. Andrew is one of our members, and he has very generously for several years, I think almost ever since we've been open here for 5 years, set up a monthly program called Café Inquiry, and he gets some absolutely fabulous speakers. So Andrew will introduce our speaker tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Reba. It's really my pleasure to see so many bright and shiny faces here. All people who are inquiring, I'm sure. In particular, inquiring about what the speaker has to say tonight, not what I have to say, so I will keep my comments short. The speaker we have tonight is from the Kinsey Institute down in Bloomington. Forgot your name.
Erick.
Erick. He's down there. He's been there how long?
I've been there for 16 years.
16 years. Okay, so he's the Kinsey Institute has been around a long time, but he's been there 16 years. And so, without further ado, I will introduce you, leave you with him. So, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I'll move over a little bit. I would like to stand behind this one. So you always stand right at the light. Maybe I should start by just introducing myself a little bit. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not born and raised in Indiana. Although I like to, I've been here long enough to feel a little bit like I'm a Hoosier in some ways. But, I'm from the Netherlands originally. I used to work and live in Amsterdam, University of Amsterdam. But it has been so long ago now that if I stay here for another 2 years, I think I've lived in Bloomington longer than anywhere else in my life. So I'm an experimental psychologist by training. There's actually an interesting connection between my background and the background of your organization, which I understand has connections with Skeptical Inquirer and what is the organization's name again, Skeptics?
Center for Inquiry, and then there's the Committee for Skeptical Inquirer and Secular Humanist Council.
Yes. But the history of the organization is closely tied to Skeptical Inquirer, the publication.
Right. That's the site of the organization that Paul Kurtz developed about 35 years ago.
About 35 years ago. And I know of that publication even as an undergrad in the Netherlands. As a student, I was familiar with it because they were originally very much focused on psychical research and sort of all the claims that were made out there. And as it happens, my first experimental studies were psychical or focused on psychical phenomena. So I guess in some way or another I've always been a bit of a fringe researcher or interested in topics that are not necessarily considered mainstream by everybody. And I was not, someone asked me, I was not a believer. I was open-minded, and I wanted to understand what might or might not be possible out there. So, as it happens, by the way, in the Netherlands back then, we had the only paid, full-time, tenured professor in psychical research, who happened to be a physicist who was very much interested in quantum mechanics, and I did an experimental study with him that was based on the observational theories, which were based by themselves on quantum mechanics. And it was a very fancy and interesting study that I did, but I did shortly after realize that, first of all, it probably would have been career death to keep going on that track, and secondly, I became more and more skeptical myself, and not necessarily in the research, but in the phenomena and all the claims that indeed were made. So instead of becoming a real mainstream scientist, I, for whatever reason, became interested in sex research. As you may have heard of the names Master and Johnson, When Bill Masters started his research into human sexuality, his advisor told him exactly that it would be career death and that he should not do it. Of course, the Kinsey Institute, named after the famous Alfred Kinsey. Alfred Kinsey received many messages that were very similar in tone. So that does maybe require some courage, maybe also some naivete to engage in this type of research. So that when it comes to introduction, I will talk a little bit about the research that I'm involved in, that we're doing at the Kinsey Institute. But I'm absolutely fine with just after 1 or 2 slides, if you are not interested in what I'm showing, to sort of go in a different direction, have a conversation about sex research in general, or the politics, or whichever questions you have. And politics are part of it. I mean, one thing that I had to really find ways to deal with transitioning from the Netherlands to the US was not necessarily people's individual responses to what it is that I'm doing, because they varied in the Netherlands too. People have this image of the Netherlands, or some of those Northern European countries, being extremely sex liberal, positive, and I like to think of them as being maybe less sex negative, but that's not necessarily exactly the same. So there's you can encounter different views and opinions and attitudes regarding sexuality anywhere. But what was really new, or a new experience for me, is how politicized sex research is in this country compared to definitely Western Europe. And for example, when I got my first federal grant from the National Institutes of Health, my first own grant in 2003, that was one of 5 grants that was attacked in Congress, and there was an amendment introduced to the appropriations bill that those 5 grants needed to be defunded in order to pass the appropriations bill. That amendment failed to pass with only 2 votes difference. So I still remember, I hadn't been here for that long yet, watching C-SPAN and actually really almost seeing this happen. So it is very difficult, I feel, to be a sex researcher without, to some degree, also not being a little bit of a sociologist or anthropologist, because it is embedded in culture. It's not just the phenomena that we're studying that are part of culture, but also how we deal with the research on or about those phenomena itself. And I don't think, I'm very respectful of people's opinions in terms of when it comes to sexuality. It is a private topic, it is a sensitive topic. There are lots of positive but also negative things connected to it. And people may think of the Kinsey Institute as a place where actually some Indiana legislators have called it a porn pit. We invite you to come over, and we have actually invited them to come over, including some of the people. I won't give names right now here, but and some of them actually have come and said very positive things to us when they actually were there. But then later in the media, they ended up just saying all the negative things they were saying all along once again. Let me tell you just a little bit more about the Kinsey Institute before I talk about the research, so to put a bit more context. I don't know how many of you have actually been to the Kinsey Institute, have visited the Institute?
Well, a few.
Okay. So, I don't know if you actually encountered the porn pit. We hide in the basement quite well. But the thing is that it is not a porn pit. Yes, we have a collection of erotica, but very much in the spirit of Alfred Kinsey, we consider those data and not something that is supposed to just lead to the induction of pleasure or possibly arousal and orgasm. So the Kinsey Institute is currently in Morrison Hall on campus, and we're small. We are small in space, but also small in staff. We have, of course, the director, Julia Hyman, and just a handful of researchers. Other than currently a postdoc, Justin Garcia, I am the only full-time researcher at the Kinsey Institute. That's how small we are. We have several faculty who are 50% at the Kinsey Institute and for the rest in other departments. Virginia Fitztham, who's a biological anthropologist, she's in that department. She's 50% at the Kinsey Institute. Stephanie Sanders, who's a professor in gender studies, who's also the associate director of the Kinsey Institute. And then we work with grad students, and a lot of our research is done through collaboration. So we're small. What I think is really important, because the Kinsey Institute would not have existed, obviously, if it wasn't for this man, Alfred Kinsey. But also would probably not have existed the way it is right now if it wasn't for his views on science, not just on sex or sex research, but on science in general. And that's an aspect that not many people actually realize or understand about him. And I'll tell you a little bit more about it. He was a biologist, a zoologist by training, Harvard trained, and ended up at Indiana University as an assistant professor. At one point was asked to teach the marriage course or to coordinate it. And the story is a complex one. I don't necessarily think we have all the answers exactly about how that transition happened, because he was a hardcore zoologist interested in insects and studying in particular the gall wasp. Kinsey was an expert on the gall wasp. He collected over 1 million of specimens and measured everything that he could about them. And we put them on a pin in a little box and attached a little piece of paper to it with all the measures. And he did that with over 1 million gall wasps. And so he had, as you can tell just from this already, a strong interest in diversity and variability. And he was very very interested in Darwin's theory. Kinsey was also already well established before becoming famous in sex research. He had written a biology textbook that was used all over the country. So he was actually quite well known before he started doing sex research. And so how he made that transition to going from insects to the human species is, I think, something that we haven't completely figured out yet. At least I haven't. The different stories. One is that he was indeed asked to coordinate that marriage course, but why Kinsey, why not someone else? Well, part of the story is that he had this biology textbook and that covered to some degree reproduction. So that would make him a good candidate. Another part of the story is that maybe if we would take someone who does boring research on insects, then maybe those classes don't get too much out of hand. Might have been another part of the story. The history is, of course, a bit more complex than that. But then he ended up doing this and came to the conclusion, as a true scientist should, at that point in time, and maybe even still, that there was not enough science out there to teach people. So I should maybe clarify that this marriage course was largely a euphemism for sexuality, reproduction course. So there was a lot of sex covered in this course. Could only be taken by students who were engaged or married or about to, or at least in one way or another could make clear that they were not doing this just for fun. He took this course very seriously, came to the conclusion that there was just not enough to tell, and he got a lot of questions, obviously, from those students. And so he decided to start asking questions himself, and I started asking his students about their sex lives. And As you can imagine, there was already back then, they were talking about the probably like late 1930s, 1940s, already some concern about him doing this. And so at one point or another, the president of IU, Herman B. Wells, true visionary himself, if you ask me, told him that he needed to make a choice, either teach or ask questions, but don't do both. And Kinsey actually decided to then only do research. He later on did go back to teaching to some degree. So he developed a survey, a questionnaire, a set of questions, I should say, an interview that grew into something of that included over 300 questions. And he started on campus, spread out to town, you know, really decided that just like with his gall wasps, he would not be able to really build a knowledge base on unless he would have a lot of people. I didn't probably expect it to interview over 1 million like he did with his gall wasps, but he did originally set out to interview over 100,000 people. And so he was actually quite disappointed he never got that far, and he didn't. He and his small team of collaborators only interviewed about 16,000 people over the course of the years, and which is still something absolutely truly amazing. Nobody has ever done something of that nature or size or since. That's a whole different story, like how we feel that we best study human sexuality, human sexual behavior is not an easy question. You have to think about the fact that back then there was nothing out there. There were people like Freud writing about human sexuality, and Kraft Ebung, and mainly people in Germany, and some British, but most of the research that involves small samples, small numbers of people, often clinical, what we now would call clinical samples. Now, people with certain types of problems. What we didn't know was what is everyone else kind of doing out there, and just a basic inventory of human sexual behavior did not exist. So, and Alfred Kinsey was not only an extremely intelligent man, creative man, but also an extremely driven and ambitious person. He was known to do nothing but work. He hardly slept at all. He traveled all over the country with his team doing interviews, and you would meet him, you would be interviewed. It was either before dinner, during dinner, or after dinner, or whatever it was. He never stopped working. And when they were in a train, because there were no planes, at least, you know, all the transportation was by car or train, he would, especially by the time he was pretty well known and famous for his research, either be reading or writing letters in response to letters that he had received. He responded to every single letter he got. So this man was not just any person. He was extremely serious. God knows he might be diagnosed these days as obsessive compulsive or something else. But he was pretty amazing in how serious he took his effort, or his goal to get a large enough overview of what people were doing sexually. So he developed this interview over 300 questions, and he and his teammates memorized all the questions. They were hierarchical, so you would only get certain questions if you answered them in certain ways. So you might be done in 10 minutes if there was not a whole lot to report, or it might take very long, hours and hours and hours. And they also memorized a coding system for how to write down your responses. So ultimately what they ended up with during an interview in front of them was just a little piece of paper, and they would just write codes on a grid And it looked really, we have, of course, we still have those, and they are a prime example of, I think, of sort of how he was ahead in so many different ways, because there were no IRBs, there were no human subjects committees, right? And there were no informed consent forms. But this was his way of communicating trust, confidentiality, like this is all we have, there are no names on this. And that was over 300 questions memorized, and the coding as well. Paul Gebhardt, who was one of his teammates and later became the director after Kinsey died, is still alive and well, relatively well, in Bloomington, living. And he guest lectures in my graduate seminar that I teach. And at one point, only a year or so ago, he told us that it took him over a month full time, bless you, to memorize all the questions, and another full month to memorize just the coding. And it was pretty serious. They were not just going around asking questions about sex life. They were very systematic, very serious about it. So Kinsey, as I said earlier, was a visionary, I think. And the more I am learning about him over the years, because when I arrived here, I actually knew very little about him. I was an experimental psychologist. We relatively narrowly focus on our own field, so we have that tendency. So I'm still learning about the Kinsey Institute myself, and Kinsey the man. And, I increasingly see him as a visionary. I actually, the more I learn about him, the more admiration develops inside of me for him. Because what he did was not just, yes, I mean, there were so many things about human sexuality that he was interested in. He mainly measured behaviors. He asked, what do you do? How often did you do that? When did you? It's all about behavior, and he's been criticized for that. He's been criticized for, what about feelings, emotions? What about love? And you know, there was he had to start somewhere, and so he would probably agree that those are extremely important topics. He didn't feel that the science was ready for that, for those more complex, potentially more complex questions. And he has also been criticized for how he approached sampling. You know, he would grab as many people as he could. And I know a lot of people in the field right now who work with random digit dialing, and random sampling, representative samples, and who do all the national surveys currently in this area, who would say, well, you know, he never had a random sample. We cannot take those numbers that seriously. And a lot of people disagree with that. And Kinsey definitely disagreed with it. I disagree with it to some degree, because I think, yes, the ideal random sample of the population is probably the best way to do it, best way to go. But then you have to also make sure that your sample is really random and that everybody participates. And many random surveys these days, if you get 50, 60 or 70% response rates, you should be happy. So you're missing out already on 30% or so, 40, or God knows what, how many people weighing up on you or don't want to answer. So to do it really well is very difficult, even with current ideas and conceptions of how to really do proper science or proper survey. Kinsey back then had a very different philosophy, because he already knew about random sampling, but he didn't believe in it. He said, you cannot, it's not going to work with sex. You cannot get a random sample. This is also the 1940s. And so he did not believe in it. He said, our only alternative is to get as large enough as possible a sample. And yeah, we may not completely agree with that, but it's not that he had not given those things any thought. He had given those things thought. So, but, and I'll say this one more thing about him, and then I'll move on to more things that we're working on nowadays. But the other thing, and other main reason why I think the Kinsey Institute still exists, and as it is on campus these days, is that he was a visionary in what he believed was data. He didn't just measure things and got numbers from people like 5 times this or 10 times that. No, he read a lot, and he built a library. He believed that art was, would give us insights in human sexuality. He took art as representations of how we feel and think about sex. And so basically he considered everything data. And you don't see a whole lot of researchers, scientists who think of it that way, who think about almost any topic that way. So he built this collection that is used still by scholars all around the world. We have a library. I actually think I have some slides on this. I was going to say, of course, when it comes to this, just to make the story complete, that their team ended up publishing 2 books. The first book was Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, and the second volume was called Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. And so those were their 2 main publications. The second volume was also mainly the end of Kinsey's career, because it's maybe a bit of an oversimplified observation, but it was one thing to show that men were sexual beings, but to show that women were sexual beings was really not done. And so most of the research was funded through the Rockefeller Foundation, and under pressure of the US government, the Rockefeller Foundation, after the second book came out, withdrew their support of Kinsey's research program. And they actually used the threat to make this happen. They were threatening to take away the tax-exempt status of all foundations in the US. So there was quite a bit of responsibility that put on the shoulders of Rockefeller. But it really, and it was really a big blow for Kinsey. And he died not that many years after that, in his early 60s. To give it a bit of a dramatic twist, of course, this story, but but it was connected. He was disappointed, and so there you can see that even though he made such an important contribution to just laying a foundation of basic understanding of what people do sexually, his own goals were actually never really met. Which is in that sense a little sad, but he still inspires a lot of people in the field, me included. And being at the Kinsey Institute is a special experience because I really see it as a multifaceted diamond. If it was just 5 or 6, or with all the people that we work with, researchers, you can put those anywhere in a department or so. No, the place is special because of the combination of research and collections. We have Chagall's, we have Rembrandt's, we have Picasso's, we have all of that through donations, by the way. And we have also amateur art and photos, and they would be hanging right next. He was not focusing on high art or low art, it was all data. How do we think about sex, how do we represent sex in society? And so it makes it a special place because we have not the most explicit images, but a lot of erotic, beautiful art all around us while we do our research, and probably the largest library, at least with this specific type of literature in the country. And we have tours. You can come. You're welcome to come. And we are opening up more and more to the degree that that is possible. So people can come in the afternoon and do self-guided tours as well. We have an art gallery, we have art shows, and we really welcome people to visit us and judge for themselves what they think we are about. So we have thousands of films, reels of film that go decades back. An extensive art collection, archives of many sex researchers who've given us all their materials when they retire, for example, and a website. I'm not doing this out of some kind of marketing or PR desire. It's more just I want you to know about this place, and and you can visit us online as well. So, I actually spent quite a bit of time on this. It is important to me to know my own background, sort of, and the place from which we are doing our research is not just a physical place, it's a place with historical value. So one thing that I often like to say about, okay, so what's the Kinsey Institute nowadays doing? Okay, great, you know, Kinsey, wonderful. People often think, okay, there's Kinsey and then now there's art. No, we're still actively doing research. We have been actively doing research. Quite a few things have happened from a research perspective over the years at the Kinsey Institute that are very important. Not all of you may be aware of this, but or know this type of work. But an important sociological theoretical perspective, which is called sexual scripting theory, was actually also born at the Kinsey Institute. Simon and Gagnon, two sociologists who came up with this in the, I think in the 60s, and so even after Kinsey, some important theoretical things have been developed at the Institute, and we're still trying to consider ourselves at the forefront with all the limitations that come with that sort of statement, because sex research is not one of the best funded areas of research, and it is a small field. There are not that many people actually doing research in this area as in many other areas in social sciences, social and medical sciences. So more and more of what we're doing now is, instead of just an inventory of what it is that people are doing, focuses on the questions of why is it that people are behaving certain ways. And that is partly driven by the fact that sex is essential to reproduction. We wouldn't be here. Nobody in this room would be here if it wasn't for sex. Yet, when I use that word, we all immediately probably have all kinds of ideas and thoughts about it, and what, you know, and feelings, and some of us will be more intrigued by what I'm saying than others. Others might feel like, you know, it's a private thing. Yes, it is, but it is also essential to who we are, whether we like it or not. And it drives a lot of our thinking, it drives a lot of our insecurities. When we grow up, think back to when you were an adolescent, when you were 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, you fell in love. Well, wait, falling in love, that's not sex. No, true, they're connected. Do we really understand those connections? No. Give us the money, we'll do more research. You know, but we have attitudes about sex, but our knowledge about it is still really, really limited. It really is disappointing how little we know about sex. And but we have opinions about it, and there are people who say we need everything we need to know. Sex belongs to marriage. We're done, right? You can figure out where to put this or that, and I mean, you don't need to go to school to learn how to get pregnant. So Darwin probably would be proud of us. You know, we know how to reproduce without. That's true. We will figure it out. But we also know that sex is more complex than that, you know, and people get in trouble, and it leads to careers that fall apart, to relationships that fall apart, to hurt. So that's another thing. Like, yeah, okay, so it's all about the negatives. Well, that has a lot to do with the fact that, unfortunately, that's what mostly gets funded. There is just not a lot of money or interest in supporting research that focuses on the positives of sex. That's play, that's fine, that's nice. It's like, you know, the same history that you see more generally speaking in psychology, for example. Positive psychology became a movement. Well, it's a movement that is struggling. A lot of people like it and are very intrigued by it. Yes, but NIH doesn't seem to give a whole lot of money for it. And that's understandable too, to some degree. It's complex. So I'm not going to pretend that I know all the answers, but it is one of the reasons why most of our research focuses indeed more on the problem side of sex. The thing is, there are problem sides to sex. And STDs, it's amazing how much research is being done on HIV, AIDS, STDs, that tends to forget that it's a sexual behavior that is one of the main vehicles for transmission. When we actually started doing research on risky sexual behavior, as we call it now, which is a very fuzzy term, there's a lot to do with behaviors that get you into trouble in some way or another. But we really discovered that there was nothing really in the literature, and we're talking now about the early 90s or so, that seemed to really address the fact that it was a sexual behavior that leads to a transmission of HIV. Everybody knew it, but there was no research looking at what happens when you are in this sexual situation, or when you are sexually aroused, and how that impacts your decision making, whether or not you use a condom. You're sexually aroused and the other person says, it's all fine with me, but I don't want to use a condom. Are you going to continue because you're aroused, or are you going to lose your arousal? Well, this is part where our research comes in, because people are different. And very much going back to Kinsey's original ideas, we are still very interested in individual differences. To try and understand the determinants of those types of problems. Sexual violence is a very broad, laden, sensitive term as well, but it is common. Sexual aggression, rape, coercion is very, very common. There's actually a report that came out only a month or so ago showing numbers that put Indiana in a very bad place when it comes to sexual violence. We're like the number 2 in the country when it comes to the highest rate of women who say that they have been forced to have sexual intercourse against their will. And I think the number is like close to 17%. So the numbers are really high. And on college campuses, the numbers of women, in particular women, who report sexual violence are very high. So you probably understand the sort of more general message that I'm trying to point at here. But not everybody does certain types of things. Men more likely than women. So you see in the literature and in the media, there's a lot about, well, this is what men are like. Of course, when you give them the opportunity, and if they miss certain values or they were brought up this or that way, this and that will happen. Politicians give men power, things like this will happen. Those are very, very superficial analyses or observations, and I don't necessarily feel we have the data to support any of this. Men are different. Not all men are equal. Not all men would engage in certain types of behaviors. Why is it that certain people are more likely than others to do certain types of things? This is part of sort of what we're trying to get at. I'm going to skip this because that's... So these are some of the things that we're trying to explore. Why do some people take sexual risks or engage in sexual behaviors they regret later? Why or how do some people develop problematic sexual interest and behavioral patterns? Sex addiction, all the things we read about child sexual abuse with or without some kind of connection to the church. What causes sexual dysfunctions? Why are some people more vulnerable to such problems than others? Those are complex questions, and complex questions require different approaches. So we try and look at those things from all kinds of different angles. We use questionnaires still. We need people to report on things. We are often asking people questions through interviews. We may do focus groups, so those are more or less like group interviews. You have like 8 people, and you record their own discussion of a certain topic, and you analyze basically the text, the words that you get. We do experiments. We can do psychophysiological studies where we actually measure people's sexual responses in the lab, much like Masters and Johnson, but then we use more sophisticated, more modern technology to do that. We can measure men's erections in the lab, and we can measure women's genital responses. We can do brain imaging, hormone assays, etc. So we use those So another way to look at it is that the toolbox of the Kinsey Institute has expanded over the years, of course. You know, it started with interviews, questionnaires, and now we have all this additional, I even forgot genetics and behavioral genetics, which is, I'll forget about this. We work a lot with different people in different places. So, let me tell you about something that I've been particularly involved with at the Kinsey Institute, and it's something that we call the dual control of sexual response that I developed together with the previous director, John Bancroft, and that is about what we call sexual excitation and inhibition. And the basic idea is that, so going back to, okay, we're not all the same. Kinsey showed that we have ideas and expectations related to sex and sexuality that to a large degree seem to imply that we're all supposed to be like this or that. You know, 2 times a week is normal, that sort of thing. Men are more like this, they come from that planet, women from the other. Yes, there are gender and sex differences. Evolution wanted that to be the case, has led to those differences. And yes, you can look at the average of almost anything, obviously. But personally, this is just who I am and where I'm coming from in terms of my thinking. I'm more interested in how people differ, how some men are not like other men. And this model is something that does justice to that idea of individual variability. The basic idea is that we propose that sexual arousal, sexual desire, as motivating forces in our behavior related to sex, depend on the balance between the suppression of sex and the activation. And we believe not only that in every situation there's this weighing of potential sexual cues or sexual information. There are people here that might or might not be to some degree attractive to you. At the same time, there's obviously a very strong social brake on any impulses that we might feel at this moment. And some people in this room will feel stronger attraction of stronger sexual impulses than others, and others may think, what is he talking about? But if I would ask you to look at each other and from that perspective, it would be threatening, more threatening to some of you than to others to do that, and to sort of think, well, what is he even trying to get at here? You know, like this is a potentially, you know, I won't use the word, but I was thinking like, you know, enough people for an orgy here, right? Whoa, that puts the brake on most of us. But that's an adaptive, that's a useful thing to have. Those brakes are very useful to have. So we see sexual inhibition, which is something that has sexual excitation, sort of the activation of sex, sexual arousal, is something that has been studied for many years and has been assumed to be very relevant. We need to be turned on every now and then, at least to some degree, or at least physiologically, in order to reproduce, especially men. But you know, we've been designed to respond sexually. Makes sense, sure. But we also have a brake system, so that will be the gas pedal, you might say. We also have a brake system. You know, there's certain moments when it is more important to lose that interest and that arousal. And so we basically propose that sexual excitation is something, let's look at the bottom first, is something that is responsive to sexual stimuli, whatever those exactly are. Potential triggers that are sexual. Makes sense. Sexual inhibition, we say, is relevant to threat. It is the brake. You know, you step on the brake when there's a red light. Well, we've been conditioned to kind of do that, but the red light is a threat, is an indicator for there's a potential threat here. You better stop. Well, we also brake because we're told to do it, but it has a good reason, because if you don't, someone may actually hit you, right? So the brake is in response to threats, sexual inhibition, and the threats can be social, like right now, to a large degree. They can be emotional, they can be physical, all kinds of things like, you know, pain can be an inhibitor, for example. So that's what we call the state part of the model. It's a state trait model in that it works like this in every situation, every time there's, every moment there's some kind of weighing, you're not aware of it. That's how we look at this. You're not always thinking about this, you don't need to do. Our brain does a lot of things without us being aware of it. But it is also a trait model, and that is more at the personality level. And what we mean by that is that people differ in their set points for those two processes. So people differ in their propensity for sexual excitation and also for sexual inhibition. And this is what we have done. Most of the work with our model has been with the use of this questionnaire that we developed, which we call the CSS, or the sexual inhibition, sexual excitation skills. And what we are finding with this questionnaire, which has been now used by a lot of other researchers, and we have data on over 30, probably more than 40,000 people right now. What we are finding is that this questionnaire picks up three things, not just two, sexual inhibition and sexual excitation. We actually have found with all kinds of statistical analyses that this questionnaire captures two types of sexual inhibition. I will tell you about more about it in a minute. So it's a questionnaire that that people fill out. It's almost like a little bit like a personality test, but then about sex, specifically about sex. What's important to think about is that sexual excitation can go away. You might be aroused or turned on or sexually interested for a bit, and that may go away. It's like letting go of the gas pedal. It's not the same thing as braking. Okay? And what we're seeing with the questionnaire is that those are indeed separate processes. So people can be high in sexual excitation. So they might be people who are very easily turned on. They don't need much, or sex is on their mind. Ping! Oh, sex. Or they may not be easily turned on. A lot needs to happen before they feel sexually aroused. So you can be someone who's very easily sexually aroused. At the same time, you can be someone who's very easily sexually inhibited. So the brake may also kick in very easily. The phone rings, it's over. But the phone is gone and bam, you're aroused. So then you're high on sexual excitation, and at the same time so that's important, that those are really separate processes, and we're seeing that. So the two types of sexual inhibition, as it turns out, we kind of, in addition to the break, I see it's already 5 to 8, so I have to kind of keep it short. I could go on for a while, unfortunately. But
we don't have particular deadlines here.
No, but I would like to have more conversation too. So let's put it this way: that in addition to that brake system that we had hypothesized, that we had expected, that we had predicted, we actually also find evidence that we are measuring with this questionnaire. We can calculate a third score for you, and that's actually what you might call the handbrake. The analogy is a little, almost too close to perfect, but and it's like when you drive with the handbrake on. So it's another type of inhibition. It's like, we call it more like chronic inhibition. It's not as much responsive to threats. What do we ask in the questionnaire? We ask questions like, okay, when I'm turned on, when I'm sexually aroused, and there's a potential, if I feel that someone might be watching us, it's over, right? So, I want to make sure that you didn't miss that. So, you would get the question of when there's a risk that we're being watched by someone, I will lose my arousal, for example. And you indicate or strongly disagree, because you can also strongly disagree. It might be arousing to you, or strongly agree, right? So. those are in response to potential threats, as I've indicated. The handbrake are more questions like, I need to really stay focused during sex in order to stay aroused. Or you know, I'm so easily distracted in general. So that's not necessarily in response to threats. It's more like that handbrake is on and the car just drives more difficult. It's harder to keep going or to get going all along. And we did not really expect that, but it turns out to be a very interesting. I'll skip this, but this slide is basically one of many that we have showing that your scores on one don't really correlate very strongly with the other. So that's support for that idea that you really can be high on both, you can be low on both. You can be very low in sexual inhibition, also very low in sexual excitation, which means that you're not easily getting aroused at all. But once you are aroused, you know, you're not easily stoppable. So maybe I'll stop shortly after. Well, I want to say a few more things about it. So what this shows, and we have again many studies where we have data like this, showing that men and women overall differ on average on those scores. Men on average score higher on sexual excitation than women, and women on average score higher on sexual inhibition than men. But and we see that all in all our studies. But I personally don't particularly find that particularly interesting. I think it's much more interesting to see how men differ and women differ in their scores. So this is the number of men and women, or percentage, that have a certain score on those scales. So this one is about sexual excitation. A lot of people are somewhere in the middle. Some people are very easily excitable, in this case men. Some people are absolutely not easily excitable. And the same is true for women. So we see the same distributions in men and women, which you know, can have implications for things like partner selection and compatibility and all kinds of related matters. And we actually have some support for that too. And this is one of those, this is the sexual inhibition type, or the score that's relevant to sort of the break, sort of how sensitive you are to certain threats, and then it's over. When you are aroused, this or that needs to happen, and it's gone. Men differ, as do women, substantially in this. So you can look at it this way, like in most of our studies, about 20 or 30% of women are way more easily sexually aroused than, let's say, 60 or 70% or so of the men, and etc., etc. All those differences exist. And we should never forget that. When we always tend to think about sex, or I see that tendency a lot, especially when it comes to comparison of men or women. This is what men are like. We all know men who don't fit those bills, those ideas. Are those not real men? No. Who represents the real man? The average man? Right? So I'm much more intrigued by how do all those differences come about and how do they translate into behavior. And I actually am showing this one because, as it happens, some of you may know about this movie or have seen it. But there's a double DVD version of this movie. And this double DVD version has a second DVD that actually has this questionnaire on it, and you can, with the remote control, answer the questions and get your own scores. You can also find it on our website. So I'll show you just a few more slides to give you an idea of what we do with this type of thinking in terms of research, and I mean in terms of implications for behavior. And another thing that I left out, throw in right now, is the idea that we started off doing this research with the idea that people who might be scoring very high on sexual inhibition might be more vulnerable to developing sexual dysfunctions. And people who are very low on sexual inhibition, so for whom those breaks don't work that well, you might say, are more likely to engage in risky sexual behaviors. And we are indeed finding support for that. In both clinical and non-clinical samples of men and women, we find that in particular that handbrake, how you score on that handbrake, is predictive of how likely you are to report problems with sexual arousal and erections. And we are even finding this in, erection problems are something that a lot of people associate with AIDS, and there is a correlation, there is an association with AIDS, but we find this connection in 18-year-olds, 20-year-olds, all age groups. And men of all ages report, some men of all ages report problems with erections. And on the other end, so is low inhibition, especially that brake type, connected to sexual risk-taking. And we do find in our studies that it indeed is the case that, in particular, cis2 or sexual inhibition, more that brake type, is associated with, in particular, things like not using condoms. It does not necessarily predict very well how many partners you've had sex with, or how important sex is to you, or how much desire you feel. Sexual excitation, the gas pedal is more strongly connected to that. This is really more relevant directly to things like, are you also using condoms in situations where you're with a new person or something? And we're increasingly look at this also in a larger context, and I'll end with that note. So the idea that, what is risky sex anyway? Well, risky sex is something that is about sexual behavior that leads to certain negative consequences. That's how I view it. And it's a word, they're words, but they refer to certain phenomena, STD transmission, unplanned pregnancies, but there are other risks associated with sex. Sex is a risky business in general. Now, you might be kind of disappointed. That's a risk you're taking. You might end up dozing off maybe a little bit. That's a risk you take. Are they not very big or significant risk? Well, they could be within your relationship, they could be. But there are also risks of emotional hurt, sort of like, not feeling, getting attention, the sort of emotional attention that you would like. Sex is risky in many ways. It becomes more risky when you think of it in the context of sexual aggression that is endorsed by or engaged in by a lot of men, on campus, and on colleges, college samples. We find that a lot of cases it involves behaviors where people are kind of aware of the fact that they should not be doing it, and they do it anyway. So we look at that part of risk-taking. If you don't know that you should use a condom, it's a different type of sexual risk-taking. We're more interested in, you know this, you know that, you know this, and you do it anyway. And that includes, then other things become risky sex. Then infidelity or cheating on your partner, in many cases, is risky sex. Because in many cases, people know what they're doing and they do it anyway. Sexual compulsivity or sex addiction is another way of looking at it, because as we know from certain politicians and others who've gotten a lot of media attention and actors, it often is associated with sort of out of control behaviors. Oh, there we go. So I have a lot more, but I think I'll leave it at that. Let's see if I have something that I could come up with. And we're finding support for those kind of connections. Oh God. Look at all those things I had. There. So maybe we still have some time just for...
Yeah, I think some of the students had to leave. I know some of them told me they had another class. So they came from a class and they had to go back to another class. Some of the students were leaving.
This is kind of a reaction question, so I need to tell a little bit of a story. Listened to a speaker last weekend who got up in front of the American Atheist Convention talking about sex and saying that we all need to talk more and to share more with everybody about whether we're polyamorous or bisexual, or we like this position or that position or what have you. And he says we don't do those things because of the influence of church. That struck me as horrible oversimplification. In your research and your reaction, do you find that this inhibition and excitation and all of that is influenced by a cultural background like heavy church activity, or do you think he's right, or do you think I just found it oversimplified.
Yeah. I think it's a very good question and a very, very important question. I mean, where all this comes from is a different question. I mean, I don't necessarily believe this is hardcore biology, although I do believe people enter this world in different ways. I mean, children are different already when it comes to just the degree to which they're touching themselves all the time, and how curious they are, and how fixated or interested they. So people differ right from the start. But at the same time, of course, I believe that this is impacted by learning and development, but we don't have all the scientific data on that. But I think more relevant to your point, or your question, is that this person's statement seems to suggest that we already know what really would be best for all of us, and there's no scientific ground for a statement like that. So if the point partly is that if it wasn't for things like religion, we would all be sharing our favorite positions with each other. I don't think that is true, because sex will. It's a very interesting, complicated intersection and point that you're making. I personally don't necessarily believe that there's a lot of support for that really necessarily leading to a much better world. We are still going to be different. That's what this, I think, what this model, what this research suggests, what other types of research suggests. We are not all the same. So why would one recipe work best for all of us? And people can have certain values about sex that can exist even if you take religion out of the equation. So it's a complicated question. It makes me actually think of some related research. We're also very interested increasingly in couples' relationship, the intersection between love and sex. Even though there's not much funding for it, I think we really need more research on the connection between those, and we're trying to do something. And because of that work, I've been reading a lot on, for example, relationship therapy, marital therapy, and there's also a little bit, I think, an assumption there that couples need to talk. Everything will be okay as long as you talk, you communicate, you express, you say. And I am actually not sure if the evidence is there for that either. We have certain expectations and ideas and attitudes towards what we should be doing, but most of it's just not really necessarily scientifically informed.
It's so hard to quantify even what he just said, because religion is much more stronger today than it was in the 1940s in the United States. We have a stronger Christian community now than we ever had before in the history of the United States.
Is that easy to quantify?
What's that?
Is that easy to quantify?
You know, you hear it all the time. And when the country was formed, it was religious freedom. There were less religious people, and there are much more religious people now, supposedly. Everything I always hear,
Have
it's
you ever
much
been to
stronger.
New Harmony?
What's that?
Have you ever been to New Harmony?
No, what is that?
It's in the south of Indiana.
Okay.
It's a very religious.
We have a CFI weekend coming up down there.
Well, my point is to
Going.
quantify. Everything I've heard,
Weekend
religion
down
is on the
there.
upswing. To me, it seems that that's reasonable, from what I see around the world. So
And you think that makes.
I think it's hard to quantify, like what he was talking about, and how to make judgments on sexuality.
But a lot of atheists and others who also would still feel that you shouldn't necessarily share your sex lives with everybody, so, right?
Well, who cornered moral?
It seems uniquely private.
Yeah. But he was already.
Well, it's kind of a relevant question to that. Are people who are more inhibited, are they going to find more outlets or reasons to be inhibited socially is that going to keep coming up regardless of religion or culture, whatever outside influences? Are they still just going to be inhibited and find reasons to be inhibited? I think that's more of a relevant question either way. What do you think about that?
It's not. Those are good questions. I'm not going to pretend that I have all of that. I should get a Nobel Prize if I could really answer that. And that's not going to happen anytime soon. So, what we're seeing just from a research empirical perspective is that if couples are more similar in how they score on a questionnaire, they are more likely to report higher levels of sexual satisfaction. But the way I look at that is that you can be sexually inhibited. But our term sexually inhibited doesn't necessarily mean that sex is not important to you or that you try to avoid it. It just means that that break kicks in when the kids are knocking on the door or when the dog is barking in the kitchen.
Oh, I'm sure there's couples out there who are completely happy and not bitter at all, just completely happy having sex like once a month or something.
Exactly.
I'm sure that exists.
So, well, no, it does, and a lot.
But I'm talking, well,
actually, a lot of couples are happy with once a year.
Well, I'm not talking about lower sex drive. I'm talking about more inhibition, like actual inhibition. Not like lower sex drive, but people who avoid sex or sexual topics within or without a marriage or relationships.
That they will, well, they'll find ways to, they will create a life that fits that. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not. Sure.
Yeah.
Over the course of Kinsey's research from his day until now, there have been some significant social changes, including things like back in those days, even later, an occasional book might come out like Lady Chatterley's Lover, and now we have 6 Feet Under on television. I think the social view of homosexuality has changed a great deal in the last 50 years or so. Does all this reflect, is it reflected some way in the statistics of what you do with the surveys? Is this more open social world that we have? Does it translate into significant findings in your work?
It's another really good question, and I think that that is really hard to measure because we don't have necessarily exact numbers that we had back then that we can compare with things that we have now. But I remember John Bancroft, our previous director, saying in response to attacks on the Kinsey Institute and on Kinsey's work, which of course happened continuously and still happen continuously. People like Judith Reisman with Concerned Women for America and the Family Research Council say that Kinsey was basically a Nazi who raped children, and they're serious. And there have been really claims, and that has led at times to the Indiana government asking us questions about, are we going to have the money that we give IU be used for this type of bad place? And John Bancroft, because some of the claims they made that Kinsey that they make is that Kinsey through his research has made us all go crazy, and just by doing the research, and that it would have informed sex education. But Kinsey was a sick man, so all sex education is teaching our kids probably bad things, and we're turning all into monsters. And now with the internet, I mean, you talk about some novels, but let's face it. I mean, when the first Playboy magazine came out versus what's now available, and how easily, I mean, it's hard for teenagers to not encounter some sexual images on the web or TV. So if that exposure, and if Kinsey also contributed to that by his bad research, would really have turned us into sexual monsters, then why, when you look at the national representative survey data, do we not see that? If people, if anything, on average, this country has not become more sexual in terms of sexual behavior than it was in the 1940s or 50s. That's what John Bancroft would say.
Hey, but I bet unwanted pregnancies have gone way down.
Well, this country is not doing very well.
I assume that when a person has sexual problems, they usually go to their doctor, I would think. And, but how do we know doctors really know how to advise patients? Now, years ago, before I retired, I know there were some professors at the school, IU School of Medicine, utilized the Kinsey library and tried to educate our medical students. So they knew something about normal sex and abnormal sex and a lot of problems. And I think that's extremely important, that doctors know a lot about this subject. Are you still have a connection with IU School of Medicine, and do you teach the medical students this subject?
A little bit.
Why?
Because, well, we're willing, and sometimes like we have a group of psychiatry residents that come to the Kinsey, and Julia Heinemann, the current director, who's a clinical psychologist, does some lecturing. This is a complicated topic in itself. I mean, I'm from the Netherlands, pretty liberal in terms of, people are complaining there about the training of medical doctors when it comes to human sexuality. And it is probably worse here, and it has been probably forever. I do believe that people don't necessarily just go to the doctor, people also see family counselors, therapists, of course, and this is a whole different topic, but I have a strong impression that there was a time around Masters and Johnson in the 60s and 70s when sort of our knowledge and thinking about treatment of sexual problems got a boost. And there was a lot of research in the 70s on treatment of sexual problems. That has sort of slowly and surely ebbed away. There is very, very little research on the treatment of sexual dysfunctions other than, pills. And which are not a treatment. They deal with the symptoms. They don't take away the actual causes. And Viagra or pills like that, other PDE5 inhibitors, those types of pills, are not necessarily solutions for everybody. But they are now increasingly sort of the first step in dealing with a lot of problems, especially when it comes, of course, to erection problems or arousal problems in general. So there was in the 70s, 80s, quite a bit of research and development of treatment approaches that have slowly slipped away. I don't know exactly why. Part of it is that careful with how much I generalize here, but it is not very fundable. NIH, National Institutes of Health, do not really give a lot of money at all to treatment of sexual problems. I don't know if that to some degree is like, let the pharmaceutical industries take care of that. I know colleagues of mine who, when Viagra was just to come out, we were aware of those things before the general public. Was saying like, oh, this is going to be so good for sex research because it's going to bring so much money. And you know what? Yes, a lot of money came in to this research, but it didn't lead to more sophisticated questions. Like, how does sex fit in relationships? How does Viagra No. So we're actually in a worse state, if you ask me, about how much this has done to our understanding of human sexuality.
Back in the 70s and 80s, there was one or two physicians, psychiatrists, who were very interested in this and did teach medical students. And it's so important. I think you ought to make a proposal to the dean or to the administration of the School of Medicine saying you're there, they've forgotten about you, I'm afraid, but you ought to make a proposal saying that you're there and you're willing to send somebody up to teach medical students about this subject.
I fully agree, but my prediction is that at best, we'll get a slot. We may talk about it for an hour or two, or maybe 3 sessions. That's not how you teach human sexuality. That's all they have time for. We are an institute. We increasingly need to support ourselves financially. And so we would also say, I can do that, or I can try and get $500,000 from NIH. What am I supposed to do? Well, if I use, it's a complicated constellation of factors.
The Kinsey Institute's been around for several decades. I guess it opened in the 50s? 40s. 40s, okay. So in all those decades, you know, it's come out, I'm sure, with all kinds of results, some of which have been highly controversial. If you look back over all those decades and all the results, can you tell us what you think was the result that they came up with that was the most highly controversial when it came out, but is now generally accepted?
Oh, interesting question. Well, if we go, I would for that probably go back to Kinsey's original research from that research, his own research team.
Okay, and what was the result that was highly controversial?
Well, interestingly enough, I think probably the result that was most controversial back then is probably still most controversial.
Oh, okay. Well, that doesn't answer my question.
Well, but in more general terms,
Women
I
like
think that
sex.
probably would, well, it would be two things: that women are sexual beings. Probably is the best in terms of that we're catching up with that maybe being true to some degree, or at least for some women. Although a lot of people still find that a strange idea that women might be interested in sex. There's still actually clinicians are from. I'll try and be really brief and then get back to the other thought I had about that. The increasingly models of treatment of especially sexual desire problems. So I mentioned Viagra, but the other big clinical challenge is sexual desire, and especially desire discrepancies in couples. You know, desire is, generally speaking, very much an interaction, a couple-related problem. And there are models out there now that talk about how women are more responsive. Their sexual desire is more responsive than men's. So, and I have a lot of concerns about that type of thinking. It's sort of, I'm not saying that it could not be true for a lot of women, but it's still not the same thing as saying that. So women might experience sexual desire if this and this happens, and if you're nice enough, there are candles, there's music. They would not have something that we would call spontaneous. At the same time, men would have that. Man's desire is spontaneous. And maybe I have even more of a problem with that, because spontaneous desire in my world doesn't exist. It is always in reaction, in response to something. Freud's drive theory has been dismissed for many, many years. There is not something that builds up in us. As far as I can tell, there's no scientific support for it. And if you don't do something with it, you will explode. It is. We live in maybe we're dealing with triggers too much, and if that happens all the time, then you might explode. Yeah, but that's still in reaction to something. So, women are sexual beings now, and in general, that is more accepted, and that's what he said back then in his research team, and it cost him his career. You could put it that way. I agree with that. At the same time, there's still a lot of thinking about women not being sexual beings, and they're responsive. Their desire only emerges from if everything is right. So there's still some of that thinking, if you ask me. Stephen, you understand my point? Yeah. So the other thing I was going to say is the sort of homosexuality, and how he brought to the fore that from a behavioral perspective, like how often men might engage in sex with other men is much more common than you might think. His numbers have been largely misinterpreted over the years. Homosexuality is still obviously very much so in this country, other countries in the world as well. There's something about that topic. There's something about that topic that makes people furious. And I am not entirely sure if I get it, but the thing is, he has shown that is there, and we're finding and we're catching up that that's not just going to be going away. That's not a choice. That's not his exact numbers have been misinterpreted, because he said like it might have been 8 or 9%, but he wasn't talking about sexual orientation or you identifying as a gay man. He was talking about behavior. And now the numbers are a bit lower, and that it's the estimates are more like 3, 4%, 5% of men who identify as gay. But his research has held up in that respect as well. But maybe the women part is more important.
What are the scientific conclusions about why homosexuality exists? Are there any recent explanations of it?
Well,
Genetically, epigenetically,
yes, there are some.
environmentally, or all of the above?
It's not my main area of expertise, but I can, from an evolutionary perspective, people are struggling still with the notion. At the same time, homosexual behavior you can see in so many species. And a preference for a male to just mainly have sex with males is also not uncommon in other species. But you know, what's the adaptive function? That's more of a more challenging question. In terms of the etiology, or you know, where does it all start? Where does it come from? There's more and more research really definitely going into the womb and sort of prenatal environment, hormonal development.
That's what I understood. It's development, mostly it could be genetic, but more likely it's developmental in the womb, the fetal, when the brain develops and the sexual, the physicality, the organs develop are at different times, so sometimes there's some confusion if there's influence of drugs or violence or something like that.
No, not drugs and violence, not that side, not in that sense environment.
Well, that will affect the mother and...
no, there's no link. No, there's no.
That explains genetics then. Then genetics, you have in families, you can see it running in families. The brother-in-law, I mean, you could see, I'm saying, you know,
yeah.
It's in families, and you can have a wonderful mother, wonderful, keeps herself, and this kid still comes out, you know, homosexual. And there's a lot of that.
Yeah, so when I say prenatal environment, I mean hormonal, for example. I don't mean sort of exposure to drugs or alcohol. There's no support for that sort of thinking.
Well, that can affect the hormones.
Yes.
Violence can affect hormones, for sure.
Yes, but what you're saying is mere speculation. I mean, you can do the studies, but there's no science supporting that.
So it's hormonal.
That's a yes. We know the more proximate mechanism, sort of the more immediate mechanisms, but what may actually lead to those changes in the environment and why this fetus and not that fetus, that's what you're more referring to, and I don't think we know. But
there's statistics that show the seventh brother is more likely to be homosexual than the first one.
Yeah, there's a correlation with how many
and that's
older brothers you have,
right.
And that's at the prenatal level. Yeah, again, this is not my main area of it, so I don't want to go too far with that. But there are a lot of people doing research looking at those mechanisms.
I have a question for you.
You've been waiting for a long time.
Go ahead, and then I'll do it after you.
Okay. Since you have lived in both countries, I mean both cultures, in Europe and here, are there significant differences? Well, I mean, you kind of indicated that there are significant differences in the way people view sexuality here and there, and but to what extent is there, and why?
Yeah. Oh, I wish I could. Those are all such important questions.
Another Nobel Prize.
I do feel when I look at the Netherlands, but even Europe is, people talk, I mean, you hear it too much in the media, like Europe, especially nowadays with taxes and healthcare. Europe is very heterogeneous, and most Americans apparently don't know that also, but Belgium is already so different from the Netherlands. Even the Netherlands, as tiny as it is, within the Netherlands, I'm from the south, and people in the north know that I'm from the south, right? Well, maybe, anyway, that's probably true anyway. But overall, I do feel that the Dutch have just a history, more of a history of being pragmatic when it comes to sex. So I don't necessarily see that as a country that is extremely sex positive and let's go all out on the street. No, they appreciate their privacy just like anyone else. But they're more pragmatic when it comes to kids. They treat them more like, you want to be an adult, you behave like one. Okay? I probably am not going to be able to stop you from having sex, so use a bloody condom. So the sex education system is actually not necessarily that much better as it is in the US. But culture all by itself just deals with it in a more pragmatic way, because I don't think Dutch necessarily believe that we're going to abstinence only programs. Yeah, wake up. Really, seriously.
Right. What about other cultures? Are you familiar enough with other cultures like in India and China and so forth, or not?
I wouldn't want to go too far with my own, and this is also more personal impression than it would be scientifically built. Yes, attitudes towards sexuality are very different. Sexual behaviors in different countries are different. Gender relationships in different countries are different. I think the U.S. is. I have a lot of questions about the U.S. and a lot of things that I probably, just like everybody else, would say I'm not too happy with, or not as a sex researcher. This is at the same time one of the most intriguing and one of the hardest countries to do this research in, because everything exists in terms of our own model. I like to say that the U.S. is very high on sexual excitation and on sexual inhibition. It is
Right.
It's stepping on the brake and the gas pedal at the same time, as a culture.
Yeah, well, Western Puritans.
Well, yes, of course, the history of the country is a different one, the people who came here. And this country is also very heterogeneous. I mean, if you just look at politics and Washington, you may get a certain sense of, in my view, it's also a bit, or my personal view, it is also a bit more of a country where small minorities with very loud voices get a lot of time on the stage. And that's not the case in the Netherlands. And we have not a two-party system. We may have like 13 or so, you know.
Right.
And you get two voices, and your 5 minutes are up. And here you connect with one of the two, and you can fly on their wings. You can ride on their wings.
Right. Okay, thank you.
But this is a personal statement.
You passed through a whole lot of slides. Is that presentation available if we came down to Wilmington to hear you speak, so we could actually hear the whole thing? Do you have a class?
I'll give another talk. I'll come back someday. I'll tell you about the other part.
And we'll give you like 2 or 3 hours or something?
I'll try and
We'll
be
have
more
lunch or
concise.
something.
I partly spend much more time than I had planned on Kinsey, and I sometimes do that. I
So
get
we
carried
can just-
away because I'm so fascinated
It
by.
was worthwhile background.
So you don't actually
I'll
teach
do it
this,
again.
but okay,
If you
just
want
come
me
back and do the rest of it. Okay.
You've been waiting for a while too.
Yes, so you mentioned that back in Kinsey's time, there were no institutional review boards. So nowadays, what is the IRB process for a sexual research project?
It's another good question, and it is the same as with. They don't treat us any different. We, I think, overall are very lucky with Indiana University IRB. I know from colleagues in other places, especially smaller colleges, you know, who are really struggling to get studies through the IRB just because it is about sex. But how, more specifically, how the process works, we submit an application, and if you treat your subjects well, and we very much respect privacy, confidentiality, even our lab studies, we explain everything that's going to happen, even the devices that people have to put on their genitals, we explain to them how to do it, and we leave the room. And we tell them in advance how all of that's going to happen. And of course a lot of people say, there's no way you will get me into that lab. Then again, if we say, well, if we pay you $200 and you just are there for an hour, suddenly things change. We also get a lot of people, and not that we pay that much for every study, we don't. We don't have the money always, but for some studies we pay pretty well. A lot of you might be
mailing list I can get on.
Yes, go to our website, and under the research page you can find opportunities too. But
Is there a frequent flyer kind of thing?
Well, he does it. He's at a college, you know, so.
It's a good one.
I'll do it.
But we go through the IRB process. One of the main things with a good functioning IRB is that they focus on informed consent. That's what it should be about. Many years ago, I actually did a study at the Kinsey in which we gave men electrical shocks as a sort of a risk-taking paradigm. Like, the longer you watch that sex film, the more likely you are to get an electrical shock. And you just have to press this button and it will all stop and you're safe. The film will stop and the risk of getting is very simple, right? The thing is, we had to stop the study because men did not press the button and they actually would get electrical shocks. Now this is a whole different story, but the main thing is, how can you do a study like that? Well, there was informed consent. We were very upfront. We told them, if you do this long enough, you will get an electrical shock. Do you want to participate? So you get, that's what the basis is of what the IRB largely should focus on. And so we do informed consent, we treat people with respect. I mean, the shocks would not be... Yes, thank you. Does that answer your question a bit or not? Is it challenging? We have developed over the years, we take the informed consent process very seriously, which has led to a good relationship with the IRB. Yeah. We don't just do that to make the IRB happy. We have a reputation to think of. So this example of that shock study is maybe not the best advertising, but the thing is that we need our subjects. So just like Kinsey with that card, we have, it's partly opportunistic and pragmatic. We need our subjects. So we better treat you well. So we take it very seriously for a number of reasons. Ethical, but also we need to get a good sample. And if only one or two people who say, oh yeah, you can do anything you want with me, that's not necessarily what we're after either. So.
Are there other questions? Well, I would like to thank Dr. Janssen for coming down and giving us a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.